Wealth changes the way people speak to you. I learned that late in life, not because I suddenly became rich, but because I became surrounded by it while being treated as if I had none. At 74, I had lived through lean years, strong years, and years where stability itself felt like a victory. Still, nothing prepared me for the way my son-in-law used money as a measure of worth, especially when he believed all of it was his. The house that evening looked like something pulled from a luxury magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows let daylight pour across marble floors, designer furniture sat untouched, and every surface reflected success. I remembered when the property was just land and ambition, when luxury was a risk rather than a guarantee. Now it was polished, admired, and quietly claimed by someone who never asked how it came to be. I sat at the long dining table, posture straight, hands resting calmly, watching him command the room. He spoke loudly, confidently, telling stories about investments, markets, and people who worked under him. He liked the sound of his own certainty. Each sentence carried the same underlying message. Wealth had elevated him, and everyone else should recognize it. At some point, the conversation drifted toward a topic I knew well: property values, long-term investments, decisions made years ago that shaped the present. I offered a simple comment, not advice, not correction, just context drawn from experience. The moment I finished speaking, he smiled, then he laughed, not kindly, not briefly. It was the kind of laugh meant to signal superiority, the kind that tells everyone listening that the speaker has already been dismissed. That's an old way of thinking, he said, still smiling. Things work differently when you actually have money. The room went still. I saw my daughter tense, saw her eyes drop to the table. She said nothing. That silence hit harder than his words. Silence, I realized, was the true currency he relied on. I met his gaze calmly. Money doesn't replace judgment, I said evenly. It just amplifies it. His smile widened. Sure, he replied, nodding as if humoring me. Back when experience mattered, back when two words designed to erase decades of work, risk, and restraint. He returned to his meal satisfied, as if the matter had been settled. Conversation continued without me, his voice filling the space again, reinforced by luxury and confidence. I stayed quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood something important. Men like him mistake reaction for relevance. Silence, when chosen, unsettles them far more than confrontation. When dinner ended, I excused myself. No one followed, no one asked if I was all right. I walked down the wide hallway lined with art he liked to point out to guests and closed the door to my room. The space was immaculate, expensive, and unfamiliar in the way luxury can sometimes feel. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the moment settle. Inside a locked drawer was a slim leather folder I hadn't opened in years. I took it out carefully. My hands were steady. Inside were documents that didn't care about confidence or laughter: deeds, records, legal confirmations. Proof that wealth doesn't always announce itself and authority doesn't always sit at the loudest seat. He believed wealth made him superior. He believed luxury equaled ownership. He believed my quiet meant insignificance. What he didn't know was that the documents he had never seen told a very different story. A story already reviewed, a story already prepared, a story that would soon be read aloud by someone whose voice he could not dismiss. That night, as sunlight faded behind the glass walls of the house, I lay back and stared at the ceiling, not angry, not hurt, certain. Because when the documents were finally opened, wealth would stop speaking for him and the truth would take everything back. After that dinner, his confidence no longer needed to announce itself. It simply existed, woven into the walls of the luxury house, reflected in glass surfaces and polished stone. He moved through the space like someone who believed money had settled every question before it could be asked. The laughter from the table didn't repeat, but its effect stayed. It had drawn a line, and from that moment on, he acted as if I belonged on the wrong side of it. Mornings became exercises in quiet exclusion. I woke early, as I always had, sunlight spilling through tall windows and casting long shadows across the marble floors. When he entered the kitchen later, conversations started without acknowledging me. Plans were discussed openly, confidently, as if I were no longer part of the household's rhythm. If I spoke, he redirected the conversation or responded without meeting my eyes. It wasn't anger, it was dismissal polished by wealth. He began correcting me casually, the way people do when they believe authority is permanent. If I mentioned market patterns I had seen repeat over decades, he waved it off as outdated thinking. If I spoke about long-term risk, he smirked and said things were different when capital was abundant. Once, when I commented on a design flaw in the house that would cause problems later, he laughed softly and said those concerns mattered when budgets were tight. In his mind, money had replaced experience entirely. My daughter noticed the shift. I saw it in her posture, in the way she hesitated before speaking, and how she watched him closely whenever he addressed me, but she said nothing. Silence had become her way of maintaining balance in a home built on luxury and pressure. I understood her choice even as it cut deeply. She was choosing stability over discomfort, and wealth made that choice feel reasonable. One afternoon, he stood in the open living room, sunlight flooding through floor-to-ceiling windows, speaking loudly on the phone. He talked about assets, leverage, and positioning. He spoke about people who didn't know when to step aside and how situations like that had to be handled carefully. He didn't lower his voice when he noticed me nearby. He glanced at me briefly, then turned away, continuing as if I were part of the Daker. When the call ended, he looked satisfied. Men like him confuse financial comfort with control. At dinner that night, he dominated the conversation again. He spoke about renovations, about expanding certain spaces, about making the house reflect success even more boldly. He referred to it as his place without hesitation. Each time he said it, my daughter shifted slightly in her chair but didn't correct him. Neither did I. Silence, once again, was more useful than confrontation. At one point, he looked directly at me and said almost generously that wealth changes perspective and that people either adapt or get left behind. His tone suggested wisdom, but his eyes held certainty. He believed he was explaining reality to me. I replied calmly that wealth doesn't eliminate consequences, it only delays them. He smiled, indulgent, as if listening to a story that no longer applied. That was when I understood fully that he no longer saw me as part of the future he imagined. I was a relic in his eyes, tolerated out of obligation, waiting to be managed once the timing felt right. And because he believed that, he stopped hiding his intentions. Articles about downsizing later in life appeared on sleek countertops. Conversations about timelines slipped into discussions framed as concern. Everything was polite. Everything was calculated. Late one afternoon, my daughter finally spoke to me in private. Her voice was low, careful, exhausted. She said he was thinking long-term, that he worried about efficiency, about what made sense given the scale of the house and the life they were building. She said he didn't mean to be disrespectful. She said she hoped I understood. I told her I did because explaining the truth felt heavier than absorbing the hurt. Silence had become our shared compromise, though for very different reasons. That night, alone in my room, sunlight fading behind glass walls, I opened the leather folder again. I reviewed every document slowly, deliberately. Ownership was clear, intent unmistakable, authority intact. Everything he relied on existed because I had put it there. His confidence rested entirely on assumptions he had never verified. The next morning, I made several quiet calls, professional, precise, conversations with people who recognized my voice immediately and understood exactly why I was calling. No one laughed, no one interrupted, no one questioned my relevance. When I ended the calls, I felt grounded, reminded that wealth does not create authority, it only borrows it. He believed luxury made him superior. He believed money had settled every question. He believed silence meant surrender. What he didn't know was that the documents he had never asked about were already moving toward the moment when wealth would stop speaking for him and the truth would take everything back. By the third week, his behavior no longer felt temporary or reactive. It had settled into routine, shaped by the belief that wealth had already answered every question. He moved through the luxury house with a sense of ownership that no longer bothered to disguise itself. Doors opened and closed at his pace. Decisions were made without pause. The confidence he carried was no longer loud, it was absolute. I became something he worked around rather than with. When I entered a room, conversations continued without interruption. When I spoke, responses came late, brief, or not at all. It wasn't hostility, it was efficiency. He had decided I was no longer relevant, and relevance in his mind was the only currency that mattered. The house reflected his certainty. Furniture was rearranged without discussion. Artwork replaced pieces I had chosen years earlier. Storage rooms were cleared, my belongings quietly boxed and relocated as if they were already excess. He spoke openly about redesigning spaces, about aligning the house with where things were going. In every future he described, I was absent, not expelled. Simply erased. One afternoon, he laid out documents on a sleek glass table in the living room and waved me over with a casual gesture. Bills, expense summaries, projections. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating numbers he believed would intimidate me. He explained them slowly, patiently, as though I had never planned beyond a single paycheck in my life. He pointed to rising costs and then said with practiced concern that it wasn't realistic for one person to carry everything forever. The message was clear. This wasn't about finances, it was about positioning me as a liability. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, he waited. He expected resistance, justification, maybe even fear. Instead, I thanked him for explaining and told him I appreciated transparency. The lack of reaction unsettled him. Calm disrupts people who rely on leverage. For a brief moment, his confidence wavered. Then it returned stronger because he mistook restraint for agreement. My daughter watched quietly from the edge of the room. I saw the conflict in her face, the exhaustion of holding two realities at once. Later that evening, she spoke to me privately. Her voice was soft, apologetic, careful. She said he was under pressure, that he was thinking long-term, that he just wanted clarity. She didn't say what that clarity meant for me. She didn't have to. I told her I understood. Silence had become the easiest language for both of us, even though it cost us differently. That night, alone in my room, daylight fading behind the glass walls, I opened the leather folder again. I didn't skim, I didn't rush. I reviewed every page carefully. Deeds, trust structures, legal protections. The will, everything was deliberate, everything was secure. The authority he believed he had taken had never been offered. He had mistaken proximity to wealth for control over it. The next morning, I made several calls, quiet ones, efficient ones, conversations with people who knew exactly who I was and exactly what I held. No one laughed, no one questioned my relevance, no one explained things to me slowly. When the calls ended, I felt steady, grounded, reminded of something important. Wealth does not create authority. It only reveals who already has it. A few days later, he mentioned casually that a lawyer would be coming by soon to review some documents. He said it confidently, almost smugly, as if the meeting existed to formalize his position. My daughter looked uneasy but said nothing. I said nothing too. Silence once again worked in my favor. That night, lying awake in a house filled with luxury and assumption, I understood the truth clearly. He believed money had made him superior. He believed confidence had made him untouchable. He believed I had already been reduced to a formality. What he didn't realize was that authority doesn't come from wealth. It comes from control, and control was sitting quietly in a leather folder, waiting for the moment when assumptions would finally meet documentation. The day the lawyer arrived felt deceptively ordinary. Sunlight filled the luxury house the same way it always did, spilling across marble floors and glass walls, softening edges disguising tension. My son-in-law greeted him with confidence, the kind that comes from believing outcomes are already decided. He shook the lawyer's hand firmly, smiled easily, and gestured toward the living room as though he were hosting a formality meant to confirm his position. He did not look at me. He did not need to. In his mind, I had already been reduced to background. We sat in the open living area where wealth was designed to impress. He leaned back comfortably, arms crossed, posture relaxed. My daughter sat beside him, rigid, her unease now impossible to hide. I sat across from them, calm, composed, my silence no longer passive but intentional. The lawyer placed his briefcase on the glass table and opened it slowly. The sound of clasps releasing cut through the room more sharply than any raised voice ever could. The lawyer began reading in a neutral, measured tone. Dates. Transactions, property records. At first, my son-in-law barely listened. He glanced toward the windows, toward his phone, toward the house itself, confident it would speak for him. But as the words continued, his posture shifted. He leaned forward slightly. When the lawyer stated clearly that the property had been purchased outright decades earlier, my son-in-law laughed once, reflexively, the same laugh he used when he believed himself superior. This time it lacked conviction. There must be a misunderstanding, he said lightly. The lawyer did not respond. He continued reading: transfer limitations, legal protections, structures put in place long before wealth ever became a weapon. Each sentence removed another assumption my son-in-law had relied on. The room grew quiet. My daughter's breathing changed. I heard it. She turned slowly toward me, disbelief forming as realization took its place. She looked at the documents, then at me. I met her eyes and nodded once. No explanation, no defense, just confirmation. My son-in-law interrupted then, his voice sharper, frustration breaking through confidence. He said this couldn't be right. He said he would have known. The lawyer looked up briefly and explained calmly that assumptions do not alter legal reality. He resumed reading without hesitation. Then the will was introduced. The lawyer's voice remained steady as he outlined its terms, assets, conditions, intent, the house, the absence of a name that expected to be included. The color drained from my son-in-law's face. His mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time since I had known him, he had nothing prepared, no dismissal, no leverage, no laughter. My daughter stood abruptly, her chair scraping softly against the floor. She asked why I had never told her. I told her quietly that I wanted her life to be built on respect, not dependency, and that I never believed silence would be mistaken for weakness. Her expression shifted not to anger but to understanding. She finally saw the cost of believing wealth alone determined authority. I stood then, not to dominate the room but to reclaim it. I told him calmly that he had mistaken money for power and proximity for ownership. I told him authority does not come from confidence or luxury. It comes from control, documented and undeniable. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The lawyer closed the file. The sound echoed, final and absolute. In that moment, wealth stopped speaking for him, and the man who believed money made him superior could no longer meet my eyes. After the lawyer left, the luxury house did not erupt into chaos. No voices were raised, no accusations were thrown across marble floors. Instead, a deep, unfamiliar stillness settled into the space, heavier than any argument could have been. The truth had been spoken, documented, and accepted, and now it occupied every corner of the house where confidence once lived. Wealth had finally stepped aside and reality had taken its place. My son-in-law remained seated long after the meeting ended. His posture had collapsed inward, shoulders rounded, hands resting uselessly against his knees. The man who once believed money made him untouchable now avoided my eyes entirely. His authority had not been taken by force. It had simply dissolved under the weight of facts. I realized then that wealth does not disappear when challenged. It reveals how little power it truly holds on its own. My daughter stood near the glass wall overlooking the property, arms wrapped around herself, staring out at the perfectly maintained grounds. When she turned toward me, her expression held something deeper than shock. It was recognition. She apologized quietly, without excuses, for her silence and for mistaking comfort for safety. I told her forgiveness did not require explanation. Understanding had finally arrived, and that mattered more than anything else. Later, when the house had grown quiet again, my son-in-law spoke to me privately. His voice was careful now, stripped of confidence, weighed down by humility he had never needed before. He spoke about pressure, about responsibility, about believing wealth gave him authority he hadn't earned. I listened without interruption. Not because his explanation mattered, but because listening no longer cost me anything. When he finished, I told him calmly that respect does not begin after consequences. It begins long before entitlement feels safe. Life inside the house changed after that day, not suddenly but completely. Conversations slowed, assumptions vanished. He no longer declared decisions, he asked questions. He no longer filled rooms with certainty, he waited. The man who once treated me as a joke now measured every word in my presence, not out of fear but out of awareness. The shift was permanent. In the weeks that followed, practical decisions were made quietly. No ultimatums, no forced endings. My daughter needed time to understand what her life looked like without wealth defining authority. I needed peace. For the first time in a long while, both were possible. I moved freely through the house, no longer shrinking myself to maintain balance. Silence, when it came, belonged to me by choice. I still wake early. I still drink my coffee as daylight fills the glass walls and the property comes alive. Neighbors greet me the same way they always have, with respect that was never tied to luxury or money. The only thing that truly changed was inside me. I no longer questioned my worth. I no longer allowed wealth to define power. The documents were never about revenge. They were about clarity, about boundaries. About reminding everyone, including myself, that authority is not bought, it is established long before it is tested. I did not raise my voice, I did not demand recognition. I let the truth stand where money once spoke, and when it did, everything was taken back.